The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the sprawling mansion. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. A young woman, dressed in an elegant designer outfit, stood in the middle of the grand living room. Her sharp heels clicked against the marble floor as she paced back and forth. She was the girlfriend of a self-made millionaire, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to build an empire. But tonight, her actions were about to change everything. The millionaire, a man in his early 30s, sat quietly on the couch, his face unreadable. His childhood nanny, an elderly woman who had practically raised him, sat beside him. She was a simple woman, dressed in modest clothes, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her presence in the mansion was a reminder of the millionaire's roots, a past he never forgot. But his girlfriend had always seen her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their luxurious world. The argument had started over something trivial. The girlfriend had made a snide remark about the nanny's cooking, calling it peasant food and saying it didn't belong in a house like theirs. The nanny had remained silent, her eyes downcast, but the millionaire had heard enough. He had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Tonight, his voice was calm but firm as he addressed his girlfriend. "You don't get to talk to her like that," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "She's family." The girlfriend scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Family? She's just a nanny. You're a millionaire now. You don't need her anymore." The millionaire's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the nanny, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This woman raised me when no one else would. She worked day and night to make sure I had food on the table and a roof over my head. She's the reason I'm where I am today. And you think you can insult her?" The girlfriend crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, please. You're just being sentimental. She's not your mother." The millionaire's eyes darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lose his temper. But instead, he took a deep breath and turned to the nanny. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," he said softly. "You've always been more than a nanny to me. You're my family, and no one will ever change that." The nanny looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't say anything, but the gratitude in her expression was enough. The millionaire then turned back to his girlfriend, his voice steady but cold. "You need to leave." The girlfriend's eyes widened in shock. "What? You're kicking me out over this?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "If you can't respect the people who matter to me, then you don't belong here." The room fell silent as the girlfriend stared at him, her face a mix of anger and disbelief. She opened her mouth to argue but thought better of it. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the mansion, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. The millionaire watched her go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the nanny, his face softening. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I should have stood up for you sooner." The nanny shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "You've always been a good boy," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." The millionaire smiled back, but there was a sadness in his eyes. He knew that tonight's events would have consequences, but he also knew he had done the right thing. Family, after all, was everything. The mansion felt quieter after the girlfriend left, but the air was still heavy with unspoken emotions. The millionaire sat back down on the couch, his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of the evening had finally caught up to him. The nanny, sensing his unease, reached over and gently patted his hand. Her touch was warm and familiar, a comforting reminder of the countless times she had soothed him as a child. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle tone of someone who had seen him through his toughest days. "I don't want to cause trouble for you." The millionaire shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You're not trouble," he replied firmly. "You've never been trouble. She was wrong, and I couldn't let her talk to you like that. Not after everything you've done for me." The nanny smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I just want you to be happy," she said. "That's all I've ever wanted." The millionaire looked up at her, his expression softening. "I am happy," he said. "But not if it means letting people disrespect you. You're part of my life, and that's not going to change." For a moment, they sat in silence, the bond between them stronger than words could express. The nanny had been there for him when he had nothing, no money, no prospects, just dreams and determination. She had worked tirelessly to support him, often going without so he could have what he needed. And now, as he sat in the mansion he had built, he knew that none of it would have been possible without her. As the night deepened, the millionaire insisted that the nanny stay in the mansion. He had a guest room prepared for her, one that overlooked the garden she loved so much. She protested at first, saying she didn't want to be a burden, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're family." Later, as he walked her to her room, the nanny paused at the door and turned to him. "You've grown into a good man," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I always knew you would." The millionaire smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. He knew that his actions tonight would have consequences, but he also knew he had done the right thing. Family, after all, was everything. As he closed the door and walked back down the hallway, he couldn't help but wonder what the next day would bring. But for now, he was at peace, knowing he had stood up for the person who had always stood by him. The next morning, the mansion was bathed in soft sunlight, but the calmness of the dawn couldn't erase the lingering tension from the night before. The millionaire woke up early, his mind already racing with thoughts of what had happened. He knew his decision to stand up for his nanny was right, but he also knew it would stir up drama, especially with his now ex-girlfriend. As he walked downstairs, he found the nanny in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread filled the air, bringing back memories of his childhood. Back then, she would wake up before sunrise to make sure he had a hot meal before school. Seeing her now, in his kitchen, felt like a full-circle moment. "You didn't have to do this," he said, leaning against the doorway with a small smile. The nanny turned to him, her face lighting up. "Old habits die hard," she replied with a chuckle. "Besides, I know you don't eat properly when you're busy. Sit down. Let's have breakfast together." They sat at the table, the millionaire feeling a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. As they ate, they talked about old times, his childhood antics, her endless patience, and the struggles they had overcome together. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed, like they were back in the small, modest home where he had grown up. But the peace didn't last long. Midway through their meal, the millionaire's phone buzzed incessantly. It was his ex-girlfriend. He ignored the calls at first, but then a text popped up, "You're going to regret this." The nanny noticed the change in his expression. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. The millionaire sighed, setting his phone aside. "It's nothing," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just some loose ends I need to tie up." The nanny studied him for a moment, her wise eyes seeing through his attempt to brush it off. "You don't have to protect me from everything," she said gently. "I've been through a lot in my life. I can handle it." The millionaire nodded, but he couldn't shake the unease creeping into his chest. He knew his ex-girlfriend wasn't the type to let things go easily. She had a way of turning situations to her advantage, and he wasn't sure what she might do next. After breakfast, the millionaire decided to head to his office to clear his mind. But as he stepped outside, he was met with a crowd of reporters gathered at the gates of his mansion. Cameras flashed, and questions were shouted at him from every direction. "Is it true you kicked your girlfriend out over your nanny?" one reporter yelled. The millionaire froze, his heart sinking. He hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly. The millionaire stood at the gates of his mansion, his mind racing as the reporters bombarded him with questions. He had always been a private person, rarely sharing details of his personal life with the media. But now, it seemed like his private struggles were about to become public spectacle. "No comment," he said firmly, trying to keep his composure as he pushed through the crowd. His security team quickly stepped in, creating a barrier between him and the reporters. But the damage was already done. The story was out, and he knew it would only spread from here. Back inside the mansion, the nanny watched from the window, her heart heavy with guilt. She hadn't meant to cause any trouble. All she had ever wanted was to see the boy she had raised grow into a good man. And now, because of her, he was facing public scrutiny. When the millionaire walked back in, she turned to him, her eyes filled with worry. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "This is all my fault." The millionaire shook his head, his expression softening. "This isn't your fault," he said firmly. "You didn't ask for any of this. She's the one who chose to make this public, not you." But the nanny wasn't convinced. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. "I don't want to make things harder for you." "No," the millionaire replied without hesitation. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home as much as it is mine. We'll get through this together." Despite his reassurance, the millionaire knew the situation was far from over. He retreated to his office, where he spent the next few hours fielding calls from his publicist, his lawyers, and even a few concerned friends. The story had gone viral, with headlines like "Millionaire chooses nanny over girlfriend" and "Childhood nanny sparks family feud." Social media was ablaze with opinions, some praising him for standing by his nanny, while others criticized him for being too harsh on his ex-girlfriend. As the day wore on, the millionaire found himself growing more frustrated. He had worked so hard to build his empire, and now it felt like everything was being overshadowed by this drama. But deep down, he knew he couldn't back down. His nanny had been there for him when no one else was, and he owed it to her to stand by her now. Later that evening, as the mansion grew quiet again, the millionaire sat down with the nanny in the living room. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, I'm not going to let anyone come between us." The nanny nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. But as they sat there, both of them couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. The next few days were a whirlwind. The story continued to dominate the news, and the millionaire found himself at the center of a media storm. His ex-girlfriend had given interviews, painting herself as the victim and claiming he had abandoned her for someone who wasn't even family. Her words stung, but what hurt more was seeing the nanny's face every time another headline popped up. She tried to hide it, but he could see the guilt and sadness in her eyes. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, the nanny broke the silence. "Maybe I should talk to the press," she said quietly. "I could explain my side of the story. Tell them how much you mean to me." The millionaire shook his head immediately. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not putting you through that. The media can be ruthless, and I won't let them tear you apart. But this is affecting your life," she insisted. "Your business, your reputation. I can't just sit here and do nothing." The millionaire reached over and took her hand. "You've already done enough," he said gently. "You've been there for me my whole life. Let me handle this. Please." The nanny nodded reluctantly, but the worry didn't leave her face. She knew how much he had sacrificed to get where he was, and the thought of him losing it all because of her was unbearable. Meanwhile, the millionaire's team was working around the clock to manage the fallout. His publicist suggested a press conference to address the situation, but he wasn't sure. He didn't want to fuel the drama, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The breaking point came when a tabloid published a sensationalized article about the nanny's past, digging up old photos and twisting her story to make her look like a gold digger. The millionaire was furious. He had always been calm and composed, but this was crossing a line. That night, he made a decision. He would address the situation head-on, not for himself, but for the woman who had been like a mother to him. He called his team and told them to set up a press conference for the next day. When the nanny found out, she was hesitant. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "What if it makes things worse?" "It can't get much worse," he replied with a small smile. "But I'm not going to let them drag your name through the mud. You deserve better than that." The nanny's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She knew he was doing this for her, and while it scared her, she also felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would finally put an end to the chaos. As the millionaire prepared for the press conference, he couldn't help but feel a sense of determination. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about standing up for the person who had always stood by him. The day of the press conference arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. The millionaire stood backstage, adjusting his tie and taking deep breaths to steady his nerves. He had never been one to seek the spotlight, but today was different. Today, he wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for the woman who had shaped his life. The nanny stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. She had insisted on coming, even though he had tried to convince her to stay home. "This is about me too," she had said. "I want to be there with you." As they walked out onto the stage, the room erupted with flashes and murmurs. The millionaire took his place behind the podium, his expression calm but determined. The nanny stood slightly behind him, her presence a silent but powerful statement. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "I know there's been a lot of speculation and rumors over the past few days, and I think it's time to set the record straight." He paused, glancing back at the nanny before continuing. "This woman," he said, gesturing to her, "has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. She raised me when no one else could. She worked tirelessly to make sure I had food on the table, clothes on my back, and a roof over my head. She taught me the values of hard work, kindness, and humility, values that have guided me every step of the way." The room was silent now, every eye fixed on him. "When I became successful, I made a promise to myself that I would never forget where I came from. And that includes the people who helped me get here. My nanny isn't just someone who worked for my family, she is my family. And I will always stand by her, no matter what." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "As for the recent events, I won't go into details. What I will say is this: I made a decision based on what I believe is right. If that means losing some people along the way, then so be it. But I will never apologize for standing up for the people I love." The room erupted into a flurry of questions, but the millionaire held up a hand to silence them. "I won't be taking any questions today," he said firmly. "I've said what I needed to say. Thank you." As they walked off the stage, the nanny reached for his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes, I did," he replied, squeezing her hand. "You've always been there for me. This is the least I can do." The press conference made headlines, but this time, the tone was different. People were moved by his words, and many praised him for his loyalty and integrity. But for the millionaire, the only thing that mattered was the look of pride on the nanny's face. In the days following the press conference, the media frenzy began to die down. The millionaire's heartfelt words had struck a chord with many, and the public's perception started to shift. People admired his loyalty and the way he stood by the woman who had been like a mother to him. Even some of his harshest critics softened their stance, acknowledging that family, whether by blood or by bond, was something worth fighting for. The nanny, however, still felt uneasy. She had lived a simple life, far away from the glitz and glamour of the millionaire's world, and the sudden attention was overwhelming. She spent most of her time in the garden, tending to the flowers and finding solace in the quiet moments. The millionaire noticed her unease and made it a point to check on her often. One afternoon, he found her sitting on a bench under the shade of a large tree, her hands folded in her lap. He sat down beside her, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. "Is everything okay?" The nanny sighed, her gaze fixed on the blooming flowers in front of them. "I just can't help but feel like I've caused you so much trouble," she admitted. "All this attention, the reporters, the rumors, it's not what I wanted for you." The millionaire shook his head. "You didn't cause any of this," he said firmly. "If anything, you've reminded me of what's important. Success means nothing if you lose sight of the people who matter most." She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. "I just wish things could go back to the way they were," she said softly. "When it was just you and me, and life was simpler." He smiled, placing a hand on hers. "Things may never be that simple again," he said. "But that doesn't mean they can't be good. You're a part of my life, and I'm not going to let anyone or anything change that." The nanny nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You've always had a way with words," she said, her tone lighter now. The millionaire chuckled. "I learned from the best," he replied, earning a laugh from her. As they sat there, the weight of the past few days seemed to lift, if only for a moment. But the millionaire knew the journey wasn't over yet. His ex-girlfriend had gone quiet, but he doubted she was done. And while the public's opinion had shifted in his favor, there were still those who questioned his decisions. For now, though, he chose to focus on the good. The nanny was safe, the storm was calming, and he had done what he believed was right. That was enough. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly returned to normal. The media moved on to the next big story, and the mansion once again became a place of peace. The nanny, though still adjusting to her new life, seemed happier. She had found her rhythm, spending her days gardening, cooking, and occasionally reminiscing with the millionaire about the old days. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, the millionaire turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," he began. "You've given so much of your life to me. It's time I do something for you." The nanny looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked. He smiled. "I want to start a foundation in your name, one that helps children who don't have the support they need. A place where they can feel safe, loved, and encouraged to dream big, just like you did for me." Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to," he replied firmly. "You've always believed in me, even when no one else did. This is my way of honoring you and everything you've done. It's also a way to give back, to help others the way you helped me." The nanny was speechless, overwhelmed by his gesture. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You've grown into such a good man," she said, her voice filled with pride. "I couldn't be more proud of you." The millionaire's eyes softened. "I wouldn't be the man I am today without you," he said. "This is just the beginning. I want the world to know your story, to see the kind of impact one person can have." In the months that followed, the foundation became a reality. It provided scholarships, mentorship programs, and safe spaces for children in need. The nanny, though hesitant at first, became the heart of the organization, sharing her wisdom and kindness with everyone she met. As for the millionaire, he found a new sense of purpose. His success no longer felt like just a personal achievement, it was a tool to make a difference, to honor the woman who had shaped his life. One day, as they stood together at the opening ceremony of the foundation's first center, the nanny turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. The millionaire smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "No," he said. "Thank you. For everything." And as they stood there, surrounded by the laughter of children and the promise of a brighter future, they both knew that their bond, forged through love, sacrifice, and unwavering support, was unbreakable.